Hey, welcome to the Sequential Artist Workshop Pro Calls. Every week we ask another creator, another graphic novelist to come sit down with us and tell us where they came from, what were the first things they made, what did they make recently, how did they do it, what are they thinking about now, how are they going to move forward, how do they keep going, all those things, career things, art things, feeling things, creative things. Every month it's a new creator, new challenges, new stories. Come check it out. Come sit down with us. You can sit down live for some of these calls by being a member of our groups. You can find us at learn.sawcomics.org. Come check it out. Come be a graphic novelist with us. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome. Okay, yay! I'm so excited. I'm mostly excited because this book, I got my weird background on, so I'm gonna have to do that magic that you do there. Whoa, how do you do it? Anyway, you know what? Just heck with it. Let's turn it off. Nope, not that. Because this book came out of nowhere to me, and it's just because I think Tessa's and my paths haven't crossed, or our networks haven't crossed, or something. But suddenly, this like marvelous, fantastic, rich, deep, really interesting, beautifully drawn book just landed on my doorstep. And I was like, oh my God, I have to know more about this creator, and we have to get them in to talk to our people. So Tessa, these are our people. I want to, so welcome everybody. We're here at SAW. It's another monthly pro call. Tessa is somebody who I don't know well. I'm eager for this talk for that reason. And their new graphic novel or graphic memoir, Feeding Ghosts, it's really amazing and deep and just really, really rich. And it's available for pre-order at this link. All right, there we go. And normally, Tessa, we just let people talk, and I'm happy to be a peanut gallery. I'm also happy to let a real peanut gallery be a peanut gallery. We're also willing to be completely silent as you speak. However you like it is fine. But we love to hear your story. We love to hear how you got to where, how you got to here. But we love process. We love to just learn about who you were before you made this book and who you are now, and all sorts of stuff like that. So I'll just let you start and introduce yourself in any way. But I'm just really thankful for this book and that you're here for this hour. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for this invitation. I feel like um, Tom and I connected because of the public library, which is one of my favorite things in the world, because I had a couple hours to kill and I had read Rosalie Lightning many years ago, and some librarian had put it as a staff pick on a table, and I was walking by and I was like, oh, I haven't read that in ages. I should reread it. And it just, broke my heart open all over again. And I was at the point of publication where I was sending galleys to people whose work felt like it was in conversation. So I just reached out to Tom and was like, hey, I just reread your book. Can I send you a galley? And that's how we've ended up here. So thanks to the public library. And the reason that we haven't crossed paths is I have a pretty non-traditional background coming to the sequential arts form. So I'm just going to jump in and all right, we got full screen. And yeah, feel free. So I tend to be on the very organized side of things, but if anyone has questions or wants to interrupt or jump in at any point in this, please feel free at any time. You don't have to be a rapt and silent audience. So hi, I'm Tessa Hulls, and you might think that I'm a comics artist, but I am not a comics artist. I am a very multidisciplinary artist who loves being deeply immersed in the world and sometimes channels those experiences into comics. And what I mean by that is I love going to really, really remote places. And I am an artist, writer, and adventurer. And this is a picture that I took while working at a science research station down in Antarctica. So I have been really drawn to literal frontiers, usually towards the northern and southern poles, my entire life. And I love being out on remote adventures. But I think during my 20s, that was sort of what I built my life around. But around the 2016 election, I think like a lot of people, I started to feel like my work needed to be a little bit more politically motivated and needed to speak to what was happening around me. So that's when I think my own practice as an artist and adventurer started being a lot more entwined with topics of social justice and history. So this was a project I did right after Trump was elected, and he was putting in a lot of immigration bans. And both my parents are immigrants, and you're hearing all of these horrible stories. And so I partnered with an organization called the Asian Counseling and Referral Service. And I went and crashed their senior social club and like went to mahjong classes and ate noodles and interviewed all of these amazing first generation elders about how they had come to the United States and what home meant to them, just to sort of counteract that narrative. Another project that I did kind of in that vein was for an organization called Break Bread, Break Borders. And that is a group based out of Texas where refugee women come together and they cook food from their home cultures and they make these big community meals and use the ticket sales from that to fund this program. And so somebody hired me to interview these women and turn their immigration stories into comics. And in my other life, I'm a professional chef who works in weird remote environments. And so this was a perfect job because at the end, I got to illustrate all of their favorite recipes. So the other thing that I do is illustrated historical lectures that sort of blend together deep history, comics illustration to talk about things that are usually just like dry and archival. So this is one that I give called She Traveled Solo, and it's looking at the lives of 7 different women who lived through this period of revolution in communications technology. And so they were sort of able for the first time to widely broadcast their stories and share them. So a lot of what I do is like really deep research and then using my tools as an illustrator to make that accessible. This is one of the women, Katie Brumbach. She's better known as the Great Sandwina, and she was a circus strongwoman. This is her performing with her husband. So he was an acrobat, and she would use him as a weight in her acts. And this is Ada Blackjack. She was an Inupiat woman who was known as the female Robinson Crusoe. And so this is one of my favorite ongoing projects, is just unearthing these female trailblazers in the early 1900s. And to talk about how I got into that, back in 2011, I went on a very long bicycle ride from Southern California to Maine. I did it alone. Yep, Honey Squeeze Bear and Good Luck Navigator Kitty Squeaky Horn, just the 3 of us. As a daughter of immigrants, I was searching for a sense of home. I spent 5,000 miles falling in love with the enormity of my country. I experienced an impossible level of generosity as people shared their homes, food, and stories. And I drank in the rich complexity of lives, perspectives, and experiences wildly unlike my own. But every day, someone would tell me the same thing. A woman can't travel alone. My own life didn't carry enough weight to serve as a counter argument, but I just did. I went on to bike in Ghana, Mexico, Cuba, and Alaska. Still not enough. So I started collecting 150 years of evidence. I found enormous strength in learning about extraordinary women who led their own lives. And I found even more strength in sharing these stories so other women could feel free. What began as an act of passionate frustration became my profession. And I won't go over all of these. These days, when someone tells me what a woman can't do, I feel methodically researched glee over getting to prove them very, very wrong. This is another talk that I give. It's about the 150-year history of the bicycle as a tool for social and gender activism. This is the memoir of one of my favorite heroes, Alaskan conservationist Ginny Wood. The talk that I give is called Women, Trans, and Femme Riders in Early Cycling History. And for that talk, I sort of talked about the evolution of the bicycle, but then put it against a timeline of US history, looking at how it intersected with gender and civil rights. And sometimes I then take these talks, which usually are about an hour, and compress them into very, very detailed timelines like this one. I love primary document diving. This one is the awful effects of velocipeding. So Kate Beaton, Hark a Vagrant, she worked from this comic, but basically there was like this fear that if a woman got on a bike, she was just gonna lose all social mores and do whatever she wanted. To which I say, yes, exactly. Um, this is another newspaper illustration from the late 1800s, thrashed by a lady cyclist. He was catcalling and heckling, so she just got off her bike and punched him. But again, so I think my career has kind of followed these trajectories where I do one thing and then something in the outside world causes me to shift to a different focus. So I live in Seattle, and back during the racial uprisings in 2020 after George Floyd's murder, Seattle had what was known as the CHOP, the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, as it would come to be known. And I used to live 4 blocks from that neighborhood, and it was where I had some of my closest community ties. So I was seeing this misinformation campaign happening in the media where I had friends who were frontline protesters talking about what was actually going on there. And that news really wasn't getting out. So I felt obligated to try and use my community networks and my familiarity with that context to go in and try and give some context-based comics journalism as to what was happening on the ground there. This was during the depths of COVID. So at that point, an arts nonprofit was working from home. So they said that I could sleep on their conference room floor, and it was just outside of the barricades. And I meant to go for maybe 3 or 4 days, but I ended up going viral as a news source and ended up being seen as a comics journalist reporting breaking news in this really contentious, volatile environment. And so I basically just set up a one-person newsroom, and I draw by hand. I'm a Luddite, and stayed for over 3 weeks until the final police clearing at the end. And in the course of that, I really got to see firsthand how the media was distorting what was happening, and how local government was really using an array of tactics to make sure that concise information wasn't getting out. That meant that I was in the middle of a lot of really volatile politics. I was getting a lot of death threats, a lot of people just attacking me on social media. But at the same time, I think what I was doing, it was clear there was a need for it because there was so little information coming out. After that, I ended up with much more of a social media following than I really wanted, because they all thought that I was a comics journalist reporting on breaking news, which I am not. But what I ended up feeling is that, okay, I have this platform and I feel like it's my ethical duty to continue to use it. So for about a year after that experience, I would do deep dives every month into some topic around social justice, racial justice, history, and then do these Instagram slide decks, sort of explaining the long arc of history behind these complex situations. So a couple of examples, looking at abortion history and how revisionist history has really been applied on that, because actually when the US was founded, there was a lot more access than there is today. And generally the way that I would choose topics, it would be something where I'd be like, oh, I see this in the news, we all sort of talk about it, but how did this thing actually happen? So like police militarization, there must have been a process by which local police agencies ended up essentially buying military surplus tanks. Maybe I'll just read 4 books on that and see what I can find out. So I did that for about a year, but in the undercurrent, the whole time that I was working on this, I was working on Feeding Ghosts, which is the graphic novel that I have coming out next month. So meanwhile, back at the ranch, this is what I was doing behind the scenes, and I've worked on it for almost a decade. So to tell you what this is about, this is my grandmother, Sun Yi, and she was a journalist in Shanghai during the communist takeover. And she ended up having an affair with a Swiss diplomat, which is why I don't look more Chinese. So my mom never met her father, and he pieced out back to Switzerland before my mom was ever born. So my grandma had written for pro-nationalist newspapers. And so when the communists came to power, she was labeled a political dissident and was put through Maoist-era thought reform campaigns. So she would be arrested, held for days, put through surveillance. And eventually she and my mother were able to flee the country. My grandma got them out, hidden in the false bottom of a fishing boat. And the two of them fled to Hong Kong at the tail end of 1957. So once she got there, my grandmother immediately wrote a memoir about this period of her life in China. And because there was so little news coming from the mainland, there was just this rabid appetite for people to know and understand what was happening. And so her book became an overnight sensation and was an immediate bestseller in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Probably goes without saying, it was absolutely a banned book in China. So once that happened, my grandmother was able to use the money from her book to put my mom into an elite colonial boarding school. And that is where my mom learned to speak English. But then sadly, my grandma's struggles with mental illness came to a head, and she had a mental breakdown, ended up institutionalized in Hong Kong's first psychiatric hospital. So my mom was basically raised as an orphan by this colonial boarding school. And because there was a stigma about mental illness, she didn't tell anyone in her life what was happening with her mother, and she kept her condition a secret. So would go like sneak out on weekends to go visit her mom in the mental institution. So eventually my mom came to the US on a college scholarship, and she brought my grandma over, and I grew up with Sunyi in my nuclear family. But like many first generation kids, my mom did not teach me Chinese. So Sunyi and I could never really communicate. And she was also really heavily medicated on antipsychotics for the rest of her life. Um, I would say I had a pretty contentious relationship with my mom and my family. And so I left home at pretty much the first moment I could. And that's when I started falling in love with the frontier and basically disappearing into the wilderness as much as possible. But once I turned 30, I sort of realized that the story was stalking me, and I was not going to be able to find peace until I turned my creative voice towards facing it and learning this history that had shaped my family. So all the way back in 2015, I started working on Feeding Ghosts, and it has been a truly massive undertaking that has involved translation across 4 languages, multiple international research trips. And this is a picture of me and my mom with my grandmother's sister in China. So I traveled with my mother and met my family for the first time through this book. So I realize this is dense, but that is the backstory. And now I'm just gonna walk you through how I actually made this thing. So pretty much the book opens by throwing the reader immediately into me and my mom on a night train in China, retracing the journey that they took when they fled. And the unifying metaphor in this book is of water and the way that it's haunted my family. So from there, the book basically goes through Chinese history using the scaffolding of what happened as my family as the structural backbone. And I opened the book with a very, very dense timeline starting basically at the turn of the century to situate how looking at me, my mom, and my grandma is inseparable from looking at what was happening historically in Hong Kong and China. So you might be asking, how do you avoid crushing your reader with this barrage of facts and relentless darkness? And a couple ways that I did that. The first is I am in the book as the narrator. I am like in the trenches with you, questioning the history even as I'm presenting it to you. And the way that I show that I'm in my studio is through the presence of my paintbrush dinosaurs, Norbert and Winnie. They're actual characters. Yeah, so this is what I keep my supplies in. And that's kind of the visual device for the reader that like, okay, we're in the present and I'm like breaking the fourth wall and we're wrestling with these topics together. The second way that I really ground the reader is everything in the book is rooted in my relationship with my mother. So that is our touchstone. It is about the two of us. And then the third way is through cowboys. I really lean into this idea of like the myth of the American West. And I use this as a framing device to talk about this clash of cultures between me and my mom. And on the one hand, like it sounds gimmicky, but I sort of build it in a way that the metaphor by the end has become this like unexpectedly poignant thing. So as the book's almost going out in the world, and I'm in the production phase of getting blurbs, I'm like getting all the ones that are expected, like haunting, epic, heartbreaking, traumatic, tender, devastating, moving. But the ones that really make me feel I've done my job are speaking to the fact that it is actually funny. Because it's obviously like a really dark topic. And I did not want to just have to sit in my room drawing my crying mother over and over again. So there's a lot of like Easter egg visual devices of being a child born in the mid 80s, of like Royal Tenenbaums, viewfinders, The Little Mermaid, and those are peppered throughout. And then the reason I chose to do this as a comic is because you can give so much information in one image that, to write this out would take like 600 words. But instead, I can say, the only way I can process Sun Yi's mental collapse is to think of it as part of the larger whole of what was happening in China. My grandmother and Mao's China both lost their tether to reality like Russian nesting dolls. Two insanities and once separate from each other and fundamentally entwined. So the book follows the structure of broad history and then how it impacted my family. And that's sort of the micro and macro lenses that I switch back and forth between. And I figured I would just give you an example by throwing you into the deep end. So looking at these, you see some propaganda posters, you see a little boy holding some dead birds, some kind of parade. And I'm just going to read you this section so you can learn about it. In 1958, Mao launched the campaign to eliminate four pests: flies, mosquitoes, rodents, and sparrows. The entire country was conscripted for the effort. Even school kids did their part, meeting quotas of animals killed. They'd bring severed rat tails to school as evidence of their patriotism, their contributions tallied and posted on public leaderboards. Sparrows were targeted for their role in eating crops, and over 1 billion birds were killed. Beaming citizens marched in public parades, bandoliers of dead sparrows across their chests as they pushed sparrow-shaped floats draped in bird corpses. The tragic irony came later, when it was discovered that birds had played a seminal role in eating insects that had fed on crops. This decimation of sparrows actually catalyzed mass starvation. But it was the technique for their slaughter that really got me. In it, I saw echoes of what happened to Sun Yi. Rather than killing the birds directly, Mao largely took an oblique approach. He mobilized the masses, turning out the whole nation with pots and pans. For days on end, the loyal patriots made raucous noise anytime the birds tried to land, keeping them on wing until they dropped dead from sheer exhaustion. In the end, they were destroyed by their own fear. It was during these frenzied, anxious months of flight that my grandma both wrote her memoir and began to lose her mind. So to bring back to my first point, I am not a graphic novelist. I am a painter, a speaker, a comedian, a historian, an adventurer, a muralist, a performer, and a journalist. And I think Feeding Ghosts was me weaving together all of the different lessons that I had learned in all of these distinct disciplines to make something that in the form is a graphic novel, but is sort of playing by a different set of rules. So the way I'm talking about this book is I'm an extremely multidisciplinary artist who spent a decade making a graphic novel. So you might want to know why a graphic novel. And I talk a lot about wilderness in the book, and for me, that is not a metaphor. It's literally the thing that my heart is always wanting to belong to. And I am obsessed with braided river bars and the way that they fan out across broad, flat plains. So these are aerial pictures of the way that braided rivers move across fairly flat landscapes. And I knew that I had to make a river. And I knew that a graphic novel was the only way I could show all of those braids. So, like I said, the uniting visual and written metaphor in this book is about water. And this is from the prologue. For my entire life, I have always heard the echoes of those waters calling after me and my mom. Those waters have chased my family across 3 generations, but I believe they can be stilled if we can find their source. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin in China. The book you hold in your hands is a record of this near decade-long journey, and it tells my story the only way it can be told. It's part of an entwined trinity in which my mom, my grandma, and I blur together against a backdrop of Chinese history and diaspora. I began with an intimate question: what broke my family? But that question led me to see how bonds shatter across time, how my grandma's fractured mind was a reflection of her fractured country, and how our cracked hearts all bled from that same seam. I have included text from Sun Yi's memoir to allow her to speak in her own words, and have spent years working with my mother to record her story. When it comes to my side, our narratives often disagree. All history is contested. But what is the family if not a shared story? And what is a fissure if not a place where truths diverge? These pages are the most accurate map I have been able to draw of the landscape of my family's breaking, and I will do my best to serve as your guide through this wilderness. So when I started this book, I felt like I was standing at an ocean, and my job was to follow all of the individual braids of this river back to the headwaters to find the source that they began. And a graphic novel was the only way I could show all the braids. So that is why I started working in this format. And to kind of show you why I knew I needed to do it this way, I want to show you this 2-page spread. So again, we have the broad history of the Sino-Japanese War, and then how that affected my family. And the reason a graphic novel is such a powerful medium is the control of time, the control of the way that you can have a reader navigate the page. So you can blend together accessible, lightly humorous visual metaphors that balance the darkness of the subject matter, while also showing the process and emotional toll of studying history and illustrating how our parents are inadvertent gatekeepers. And I can't actually see what that says because of the sidebar of all your faces, but you can read that. Yeah, but anyways, you can't do this in a written book. You can't do this in paintings. You can only play with time in this way with sequential art. And I would say everything that I did in this book is like painfully intentional. And the other thing I was able to do is show the repetition of history and show the repetition of intergenerational trauma by literally redrawing the same poses in 3 generations. So here we have an authority figure forces someone powerless into an incriminating action, with my grandma having to write false confessions in 1949. Then we have an authority figure forces someone powerless into an incriminating action with my mom in 1956. And then an authority figure forces someone powerless into an incriminating action with me and my mother in the 1990s. And you can see, I don't know if anyone reading this book will notice this repetition because these are, hundreds of pages apart, but the bones of it, things like this are everywhere. Okay, process. I think not being a graphic novelist, I did this in a very unorthodox way. So I drew the whole thing by hand in Japanese brush pen. It is not digital. I wish I had counted how many of these I went through because I needed the bristles to stay crisp. I'm guessing probably like 40. And then I would get my composition hammered out. I made templates that had the panel sizes I found myself using most often. And I would get them hammered out with my little one and then gradually scale them up to finish size. And see, there's Winnie being her Triceratops self holding my brush pens. And then I would trace them on a light board, which this was my sophisticated setup because of the lighting fixtures. And also, since I worked on this for almost a decade, I worked out of 5 different studios over the course of this. The last one that I drew most of the book in was in this weird little area above a former cow barn on a hippie compound in Port Townsend, and it wasn't insulated or heated. So this was my outfit. And then for the most part, I didn't use reference pictures, but for some things that I like wanted to get right or see how it looked, I would, do things like bundle up my sleeping bag into the form of a human body because I had to draw my mom holding her grandma's corpse. It was really fun to spend COVID doing this. So I made a little rule for myself that retaining sanity meant that the cameos from my paintbrush dinosaurs had to be at least equal to and ideally greater than the number of times I had to draw my weeping mother. And that was like actually a fairly hard equation to maintain. And maybe I'll go back through and count. I never did, but that would be a fun statistic. So part of the way I tried to have joy in the process is I was a painter before I started doing this. And I would give myself what I call my my guitar solo pages, where I would do a 2-page spread that was much more just like being a painter than working in comics. So again, none of this is digital, but there's a couple spreads like this in the book where, yeah, there are some panels, I suppose. And to give a sense of scale, the original pages were 9.5 by 12.5. And I calculated what the surface area of that would be. It's about 4,000 square feet of ink. And that's about 18 elephants to make that a little abstract. But because colonialism is the elephant in the book, I thought it would be better to use this kind of elephant. So this is Babar drawn 18 times over. Also, don't reread those books if you want to still love them. They are worse than you remember. So like they don't hold up well. Okay, so structurally, how did I make this thing? I came back from China having gathered all the logistical puzzle pieces I needed to form the bones of this book, but my heart wasn't ready. So I think I hid in the drier side of it until I was ready to really face the emotional part. So step one was history. That was me reading well over 100 books to sort of educate myself about the Chinese history I needed to know to understand my family's context. And I'm a really, research is a huge part of what I do, and I feel a huge sense of responsibility to do the best I can to get it right, especially if I'm talking about things that I haven't experienced firsthand. So I read well over 100 books. Then I had to learn how to draw graphic novels. I had no idea. I didn't grow up reading them. So I would go to the Seattle Public Library and I would just grab a stack of them at random every week. And I would take them home and I would draw in the style of those makers. And I would do little like sketchbook critiques of what worked and what didn't. And would sort of magpie the elements of all of these things that I wanted to emulate. And so by the time I started, I knew exactly what I was gunning for. I wanted to combine the intellectual and literary rigor of Fun Home with the melding of personal and historical narratives of Persepolis, with the tenderness of Blankets, drawn with the fluidity of This One Summer and the precision of Black Hole, with miscellaneous inspiration from Epileptic and The Best We Could Do, and then a whole slew of things that aren't graphic novels. So I think I went into this very clear and very ambitious about what I was trying to make. And I think the reason I was able to go in with this level of ambition, this is a picture of my potato harvest. Even though I wasn't a graphic novelist, coming into this meticulous and fluent in other mediums, it meant that I could break all the rules. So it's like, it would be incredibly ballsy for me to be like, let me just make Persepolis, Fun Home, Black Hole for my first book. If I hadn't sort of already learned all these other formats that did give me like a toolbox going into it. So third thing I did, I lived alone in an off-grid cabin for half a year and got the bones of the written structure in place. So I did this thing called the Margery Davis Boyden Wilderness Writing Residency. And it's a program that's been going on for, I believe, 32 years now, where each year one writer gets to experiment with extreme solitude, and you get given an off-grid cabin in the Rogue River Wilderness out in Southern Oregon. So there's no cell service, there's no continuous electricity, and you are a 2-hour drive on back logging roads from the nearest town. So I think it's probably the only artist residency in the world where one of the requirements is that you have to be comfortable using a chainsaw, because if a tree falls on the road, nobody is going to clear it for you, and it is on you to clear that tree and get out. So I also went irrevocably feral while living out there, never quite came back to society. And I grew all my own food. I did outside world runs about once a month, and I just sat with my dog and stared at a river a lot, which is probably had a huge part to why I always approach this book as making a river. So while I was living out there, the book is structured into 11 parts, and each part begins with an epigraph. And for me, that was how I learned the structures. Like the epigraphs were actually what came first. They became the foundations, and I built the book out around them. And so to kind of give an idea of who my influences are outside of graphic novels, I think it's actually a kind of perfect microcosm of what's in the book. So it's like OG writers of color, Toni Morrison, Maxine Hong Kingston, Audre Lorde, lyrically beautiful white ladies, Rebecca Solnit, Barbara Kingsolver, New Guard immigrant kids' voices, Ocean Vuong, How, deliberately problematic white men and wilderness luminaries, random British dudes, Ian McLaughlin, psychologists, Alice Miller, and then OG poets, Adrienne Rich. And I think the way that I work is I always make the front of the jigsaw puzzle with like the little picture, and then from there expand into the larger thing. So these ratios are actually, I think, very similar to what the book braids together in its influences. And once I had done all that, I gathered and sorted the material to braid. So this is my studio in Port Townsend, and I started plotting out the whole book on my wall with this color-coded system where you can see on the bottom what the color coding is. Pink, not sure yet. It means I literally don't even know if it's something I'm going to write, draw. Green was historical context, orange for quotes, yellow for primary documents. And then I was working with 6 different timelines. So China present, China past, my past, Hong Kong present, Hong Kong past, and my present. And so I also had the recurring themes I knew I wanted to weave into the whole book. And then I literally just started plotting out the entire book on my wall to make sure that all of these timelines and all of these elements were a cohesive, woven whole. And again, I was making a braided river. In my mind this whole time, that's what I was doing, because I knew that I needed to have the continuity of these braids. So then for about 3.5 years, I braided, and drew and wrote the actual pages. And I drew the whole book simultaneously. I do not recommend this. And I actually blame David Lasky for this. I'm sure many of you know him. So like back before I started this, we're friends in Seattle, and he gave me the very good advice to not start drawing at the beginning, because your style will settle into itself and evolve. And me being me, I took that to an extreme and like didn't draw anything sequentially. So to explain a little more, the way that I work as a painter is I get some phrase that's lodged in my head, and then I have to make the body of work to understand what it means. So I make the entire body of work simultaneously and rotate through the pieces on my wall. So this was from a show called In the Eye of the Storm. Same thing here. This is all from the same show called Scenes from the Exodus. This is from one called How Goes the Battle. So this is how I've always worked, is I have to make all the work at once. And for better or for worse, that's what happened with this book, where it began with the phrase of text I got lodged in my head. In this case, someone has to feed the ghosts. And while usually this process takes me 3 to 9 months, this just took me a decade. And instead of like 9 to 16 paintings, I had to do it with almost 400 pages. So drawing it simultaneously, how did I even start? How did I track this? I used the computer program Scrivener, which a lot of nonfiction writers and journalists use, because it essentially is a way to have an infinitely large binder and also an infinitely large bulletin board. So I took the 10,000 word outline that I wrote in the woods, and I laid out approximately what I thought was going to have to fit on every page, so that I knew about how many pages the book would be. And it's not that it was anyway like a description of this is what happens on this page. It might be something like, by the time I was a teenager, my mom and I were at war. So as to what the text on that will be, as to how that will be illustrated, like TBD, figure it out later. And then I started drawing the book by section. So what I did is I put molding on the wall of my studio, and I would punch holes in the top of the pages, and I would keep track of them based by section, so that I could be working on I would say probably maybe like 30 active pages at a time, but they were from literally every part of the book. So I think I drew for a year and a half before I had more than 3 pages that were sequential. And I basically popcorned in finished pages into my Scrivener so that I could track how this process was coming together. And eventually I got to something where it was like pretty much a finished book. And yeah, editing was really challenging. So the text is a digital layer. And when I did work with my editor for that part, we edited the whole thing in a Word doc because it was 60,000 words, which is definitely way more than most graphic novels. Um, and basically, I was making all the individual pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and just told my editor she was going to have to trust me that they were going to fit. So, did I know how much work this was going to be at the onset? No, no, I did not. I feel a little bit like, oh, sure, I can march the ring across Mordor and throw it to Mount Doom, no problem. And decade later, I think I got to a point of just please, for the love of God, give me human interaction. This was a very lonely, heavy process. Um, when I had gotten the book finished enough for it to be possible for my editor to see what I was doing, I commandeered the studio of a sculptor friend who had a very large wall, and I printed the whole thing out so that 4 pages could fit on one 8.5 by 11 sheet. And I put them on the wall, and I walked my editor through, and I said, okay, here are all the through lines, here are the themes, here is like this massive thing I've been holding in my head, and I promise it does make sense. And so every section of the book ends in water, reinforcing braided river, braided river, braided river. So looking at the whole thing, I was able to walk my editor through and say, like, here are all the things that I'm weaving in, here are all the timelines, here's how it's going to fit. And so in that way, I think the editing process was sort of built into how I made the book because it had to be so compulsively deliberate from the drop. So yeah, kind of to summarize, Feeding Ghosts, it's looking at loss of language and culture, mental illness, intergenerational trauma, history, complicated mothers, isolation, colonialism, and mixed race identity. Also surprisingly funny. And out came this like weirdo book. But ultimately, it is a story about how mothers and daughters both damage and save one another. And it begins and ends rooted in that relationship. So it comes out in 28 days, and I am just trying to get ready for that wild, wild process. And yeah, it's fun to join you and kind of talk process about how I made this thing. And yeah, I will stop screen sharing and we can move to the talking part. All right, my cursor is okay. There. Stop share.
Um,
All right.
wow, Tessa, thank you. Holy moly. Well, let's take some questions. If people have questions, raise your hand. I've got one or two. Um, it's hard to know where to start. I keep putting the link to pre-order it in the chat, y'all. So I do have one question. It seems like the way you presented it just now that there was a kind of a separation between this this time period in the woods, this 6 months in the woods, these 10,000 words of your synopsis or outline, and the actual like making of the thing, which was 3.5 years. Um, I I usually find that there's a lot that happens that we weren't expecting in the making of the thing. Were there a lot of changes and upsets and surprises that sort of upended what you thought you were doing during the process of making it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. At like every turn. I went into this originally being like, this will be about history. There will be no squishy feelings. I will not be a part of it. And so I think it was kind of a journey into emotional vulnerability and allowing the history of the story to be something that I felt rather than just analyzed. And as the story progressed, I kind of started thinking about myself as a character as being this like rogue narrator that I think I did not expect to appear. It was almost like this honey badger just like hijacked the story, and I was kind of like, okay, I guess you need to be in here now, and like if this is where we're going, I'll go there. But yeah, I would say in general, when I read my grandmother's memoir, it really destroyed a lot of the clean answers and like black and white clarity of the story that I had been raised on about my family myth, where it turned out that she was a much more complex character than I had thought. And so I found myself in real time having to contend with the fact that I was working with a story with a lot of gray area, and I found myself really leaning into that and trying to bring my viewer in so that they would have that emotional experience along with me.
Awesome. That's really great. Yeah, thank you. That helps a lot. All right. Martha's got a question. Hi, Martha.
Hi. Let's see. I'll lower my hand. Okay. That was incredible. Even the presentation was super organized. I really liked the way you honed in on metaphors that helped you think through your own story at different places. Because I'm on the writing about comics side, and I always like to find the metaphors, right, and sort of talk about them. I guess it's more a comment or it could be a question, but one thing that really struck me, I've seen Chris Ware speak and I've seen Alison Bechdel speak, and they both had these elaborate spreadsheets, and you do too, like, and that's okay. Like my dad would always be like, oh, you're such an obsessive compulsive weirdo. I'm like, actually, that's how you make the work. And I think it was really cool the way you worked on it simultaneously, because one thing I wonder about a long form work, and this isn't something I'm ready to do or maybe want to do, but like your style might change over time. So you'll get the beginning of Mouse and you'll get the end of Mouse, and his line is a little bit different. Or Charles Schulz, his line is a little bit different through time. So I think what you did there, I mean, did you find that a good way? There's a question. Did you find that a good way to modulate it so the style was consistent across the book? Because I can imagine that would be an issue.
Well, I think you're right that in general it spread out the unevenness instead of putting it within one temporal section of the book. But since I was kind of building the ship as I was sailing it, because it wasn't a format that I had worked in before, what that ultimately meant is that a lot of the earliest pages I had to redraw, which I had reconciled myself with. I think I had to redraw maybe 20 pages. And so I just was like, well, I made the world's most intricate thumbnails for that section. It's fine. But what I did have to do at the end is, because the way in which I rendered, the characters' faces, I think that's one of the things that takes the longest to really get when you're trying to stay in the same visual vocabulary, is like, how do I actually draw these people? And so at the end, when the whole book was collated, I did go back with an iPad, and some of the faces I redrew to make them more consistent, because that's where I would say it looked the most jarring to me, when you had a page that was drawn 3.5 years apart, following sequentially. But in general, I think it worked, and by doing it all simultaneously, it kind of kept the process as a constant conversation. There was never a point where it was just like an autopilot production mode. And I think for me, that allowed for the element of surprise, in a way that wouldn't have been possible if it had been more structured from the outset.
Great. Just quickly, just to follow up, when you redrew the faces, that was in Procreate or Photoshop
Yeah,
or?
yeah, Procreate.
Okay.
And I'm a Luddite, and I had to learn Procreate for this part of the process. And to me, like, Procreate is just like, I have a paper feel on my iPad, and so it was the
Yeah, I do
easiest.
too.
That
Yeah,
felt like it still had a line quality that my hands understood.
cool. Amazing. Thank you.
I know we have a lot of, oh, there we go. Some more questions popping up. Okay. Okay, we'll go to Chris and then Maria. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I saw that you had a stack of Canson XL there. Was that a go-to paper? And the other question is, when did you know that your story had a home? Like, did you have to make a book deal first, or did you just have to get it out there and then have a destination for it?
Yeah, I drew the whole thing on Canson XL paper, which is great because it's like the cheapest workhorse paper, and it was also my favorite. I really like the amount of tooth that it has without being precious. And so the way that it came about, um, I kind of came up through the publication process much more in literary world than graphic novel world, and so I went to a lot of residencies and met somebody at a residency who saw what I was working on and told me she had to introduce me to an agent. If I had known who she was going to introduce me to, I would have been like too intimidated to have a conversation, because I ended up signing with Anjali Singh, who's best known for finding and championing Persepolis. And so it was great because like I wasn't ready to look for an agent. I didn't query. Somebody I met was like, oh, have a phone call with this person. And so I ended up with an agent before I went into the woods and told her that I was going to have an outline of the book by the time I emerged. And when I was living out there, the only way I could communicate was through an unreliable radio phone. And so I went to the Grants Pass Library, sent my agent this 10,000 word outline, and she called me on the radio phone the next day and was like, I had no idea. Because it's like I was like, yeah, I've got this wild true story in my family. But I think once people hear more of the minutia, it's like there's a lot of intersections in the way that it can be used to teach history in like a really rich capacity. So basically, I wrote a proposal while I was out in the woods, and the book went to auction the day after I left. So that was a jarring transition. Yeah, so I got back to society, signed a book deal, and then COVID happened and the world ended. And that's how I spent COVID.
Wow. So a book deal on an outline alone.
Yeah, so I did it with 10,000 words and 16 drawn pages.
And drawn pages. Great. Okay, Maria and then Dusty.
That was a good question. But I was kind of amazed by your research abilities. And I was thinking, did you learn a lot of how to do that from your talks that you do? And where do you do those talks? Like the talks about the women bicyclists and the women adventurers and stuff.
Yeah, so I would say I grew up in a town of 350, and so I didn't have a lot of friends, and there wasn't really anything to do. So I remember walking down to the public library and demanding a library card when I was 5. And so I've always just been a really, really voracious reader. And to me, all research is you read a book, you go to the bibliography, you read everything in the bibliography, you repeat. And so for me, it's like a huge amount of, I think, how I've turned out as a human and what my career has turned into comes from being a natural speed reader and being somebody who just loves devouring books until I start to understand the web of how different perspectives all inform one another. I think that's really all it takes to be a researcher is to just keep reading and keep asking questions and to love talking to people. So it happened kind of organically. And then those talks, I feel like I'm a little bit like emerging from a cocoon, because this book and also COVID has sort of just took away everything else I used to do. And so I haven't really been doing that for the past handful of years. And I'm really only now just starting to be open to doing speaking engagements again. So that's my roundabout way of saying, I don't know yet, but I'm open to it.
Well, this talk was great. Thanks, Maria. Dusty's got a question.
Hey, Tessa, nice to meet you. I loved your presentation. I can't wait to read the book. I also call myself a Luddite, and I draw everything by hand. I'm just wondering what your thoughts about the advantages and disadvantages of doing that are.
I mean, I think the clear disadvantage is time and the ability to endlessly change your mind. But I think that's actually also the advantage, is it really, drawing by hand, forces you to commit. It takes away the ability to equivocate. It stops you from being at least for me, I think it stops me from being precious. And so I think I'm actually at a point where I'm trying to move to working digitally a little bit and find that it actually takes me way longer. So I don't know, I'm like TBD as to how I'm going to bring that in or not. But you know, it's like drawing digitally, there are so many extraordinary tools that I am only now learning about as I'm teaching myself Procreate beyond just the basics that I learned to do this book. Where I think if you can like kind of move back and forth and intermingle and use both, that to me I think is going to be the sweet spot. But there's nothing for me that's ever going to replicate the tactility and finality and just like ink soaking into paper tooth. I don't know, there's just like a visceral satisfaction that I don't think I will ever be able to fully give up. And I think that's also why now that I'm sort of beginning to think about being free to work in some other mediums again, I have this strong suspicion that when I next work on something, it's going to be painting, kind of going back to my first love.
Wow, an awesome answer.
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
All right. Any more questions for, I mean, I feel like we could ask lots more. Do you feel like there's an emotion? Oh, wait, we have a question. I'll finish mine real fast. Do you feel like, Tessa, there's an emotional, I think you might have already said this, quality to that ink in the paper that isn't there when you're working digitally, right? And so if you're going to do a book this deep and that's putting you on such an emotional journey, is it more power? I mean, I guess I'm showing my biases. I'm basically hoping you'll answer yes. Is it more is it more emotional to actually work analog than not? But you know, yeah, I don't know. That was really leading the witness with that question. Sorry.
No, I do. I think I have the same bias. And I think for me, a huge part of it is being somebody who is so called to and grounded within the natural world. So when I finished the book, I got a job working part-time as a landscaper. And I also started volunteering at an urban forestry restoration project and doing trail work. And I wrote in my acknowledgements, like, kind of not kidding, that I'm just going to refuse to go on book tour because I've decided to become a stonemason. And so I think for me, I learned through my body. I learned through the meditative practice of just touching the world. And I don't think that's true of everyone. I think particularly people who are digital natives who sort of learn to draw in that way. I think there's probably not that same disconnect. But
Right.
as somebody who didn't do that, like there is something that's lost for me. I can't embed myself in the process in the same way digitally.
It's a wonderful answer. Thank you. All right, we'll take one last question and then call it. This Goody How. Go ahead.
Hello, thanks for the talk. That was amazing. Like, that was really good. I got lots of notes written down and stuff. But I wanted to know, this was like a deeply personal project for not only you, but like your family. Like, how did they react to?
My mom, you know, I feel like I got the immigrant parent unicorn where like most of my friends who also have immigrant parents are like, yeah, our parents never want to talk about like the dark past or the old times. But my mom, for whatever reason, is the exact opposite. And like all she's ever wanted is to like go together into the dark wellspring of trauma. So he was really on board with this. But I will say it was a really challenging process where we had a lot of blowups and we had a lot of mutual misunderstandings. But I think both of us have come to view the book as like a bilingual dictionary that we wrote together, where we didn't realize that we had this language barrier because we're both speaking English, but we didn't understand the sets of cultural assumptions that we were each bringing into the relationship until we made this together. And now we can sort of be like, oh, you're being Chinese, I'm being American. Cool. That's why we're like butting heads, and we don't have to yeah, like there's no blame. Nobody's doing anything wrong. We're just sort of like, okay, explain to me the rules of physics that are governing what you're doing right now. So yeah, she was really on board, and I mean, we'll see how that goes in 28 days when it actually goes out
When it
publicly.
comes And if I could, just one more question. Did it feel good to finish? Was it like, did you feel better that it was done? Or were you like, why did I do that?
That is a work in progress. I'm getting closer to feeling better, but I do think that there's people don't talk as much as they should about the huge psychic and emotional toll of spending this long digging up these really painful, dark stories and then living inside of them. And I think for me, having to do it during COVID was emotionally devastating because I had to do it without any of the things that I think would have made this process feel less isolating. So I think right now I'm preparing for book launch, probably like to the great consternation of my publisher. I'm not doubling down on all the promotional stuff I should be doing, and I'm instead doing things that bring joy and play and human interaction into my life. So like after this, actually, I'm doing a 2-week mentor position with this really awesome nonprofit in Seattle called Sawhorse Revolution, where they teach high school students carpentry skills by having them build infrastructure for local nonprofits. So after this, I'm going to put on my Carhartts and I'm building an outdoor kitchen with a pack of teenagers and ignoring my publisher's emails. So that's what I'm doing. Like, and I think like doing that, it's getting me back to like, this was really, really hard. And like 95% killed me. And I think I'm going to get to the point where I was like, yeah, that was worth it. But I have to get myself back to my own solid ground first. Yeah, it will be worth it. It will be. But
Okay.
I was no like immediate catharsis when I was done.
Okay, I'm gonna, as a way of sort of transitioning into your carpentry mode, I'm gonna remove your spotlight because I know authors don't love looking at themselves forever, and I don't want to treat you like an author on book tour anymore. But I do want to say this book's remarkable, and this talk was amazing, and I'm so glad we had a chance to hear from you and to sort of connect or meet or something. If you do happen to go to a comics festival, let me know what one it is, and if I go, I'm gonna
Yeah,
just
yeah.
say hello.
I should say I'm planning book tour now, and we'll probably be posting. Oh, I'm on Instagram as at Tessa Hulls. I'm here. I'll put it in the chat. Thank you. And I've been hiding from social media. I'm just anyways, but I'm coming back out, and I'm probably going to be posting my book tour schedule at the end of this week or early next week. And since I'm somebody who loves to live on the road for long periods of time, like I'm going out for the foreseeable future. So I'm just using this as an excuse to visit my friends all over the country. So yeah, I don't know where all of you are located, but there is a decent chance I will be near you and would love to meet you in person.
Awesome. Tessa, this was so great. It's so nice to meet you. I'm so glad we connected. And I know the people here are really appreciative too. Everybody just, let's just let Tessa have the rest of her day and give a little applause and we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much. Buy that book. I'm putting it one more time in the chat.
Thank you. It's great.
All right. Good luck getting this book out. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.